Into the tunnel, Custer's last hour, a battle unfolding in shadows. The Battle of Little Bighorn is shrouded in myth and legend, but at its heart is a tragedy marked by the decisions made in the last hour of George Armstrong Custer's life. This was no ordinary battle. It was a turning point, a clash between the relentless ambition of one man and the full strength of a people defending their way of life. Over the years, historians have pieced together fragments of evidence, but the final hour remains a tunnel of uncertainty. What did Custer truly see? How did he react to the changing battlefield? Most importantly, what choices sealed his fate and the fate of his men? This video ventures into that tunnel, providing not just a chronology but a deep dive into Custer's most fateful decisions, revealing the nuances and miscalculations often overlooked in popular narratives. The heat was oppressive, hanging thick over the arid landscape as George Armstrong Custer surveyed the horizon. It was June 25, 1876, and at 1:05 p.m., Custer knew he was on the brink of a decisive moment, one that would either cement his legacy as a brilliant commander or unravel into disaster. The Seventh Cavalry had crossed the Rosebud Little Bighorn divide, and every step brought them deeper into the unknown. To Custer, the stakes could not have been higher. His regiment was tasked with subduing a massive coalition of Sioux and Cheyenne warriors who had gathered in defiance of U.S. government orders. What Custer couldn't know then was that his final decisions would send him into the tunnel of history, where speculation and conflicting testimony would forever cloud the true nature of his last moments. As Custer looked over the rugged terrain, he made the bold choice that would define his final hour. He would split his regiment into 4 separate battalions. Historians have long debated this decision, with many claiming that it was a strategic error, a move that fractured his forces at the moment when unity was most needed. But Custer had reason to believe otherwise. His scouts had reported signs of a large village ahead, nestled along the banks of the Little Bighorn River. It was a village larger than anything Custer had anticipated, and to him, it was clear that the element of surprise was slipping away. In the face of overwhelming numbers, Custer believed speed and audacity were his greatest assets. His plan was simple, yet daring. Major Reno would lead 3 companies to attack the village from the south, a frontal assault that would draw the enemy's attention. Meanwhile, Captain Benteen would take a battalion and scout the ridges to the left, ensuring that no Indian forces could escape to the west. Custer, always determined to lead from the front, would take 5 companies to the right, moving swiftly along the high ground to flank the village and prevent any escape to the north. The final battalion, led by Captain McDougal, would guard the packed train and serve as a reserve force. The separation of forces was not just a tactical choice, but a psychological one. Custer had built his career on daring moves, often outmaneuvering and outthinking his enemies. He had faced Native American forces before, and his aggressive approach had always led him to victory. But this battle was different. The village ahead was vast, teeming with thousands of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, more than Custer had ever faced in a single engagement. Yet convinced that a quick, coordinated attack would send the village into chaos, Custer believed that dividing his forces was the key to success. As the orders were issued, the regiment moved with haste. Reno's battalion, positioned on the left, marched swiftly down the valley. Custer's column paralleled them on the right, but soon the terrain caused their paths to diverge. Custer, Reno, and Benteen were now separated by both distance and geography, a fact that has been emphasized in this video to a greater degree than in previous narratives. The moment of separation, though physically brief, marked the beginning of the end for any coordinated effort. From this point forward, each battalion would be on its own, reacting to an increasingly chaotic battlefield. Reno, unaware of the sheer numbers awaiting him, charged forward. Custer, meanwhile, continued to push his men northward, his mind focused on cutting off any potential escape. The records often focus on Custer's audacity, but they rarely emphasize the complexity of this decision. Custer wasn't just gambling with the lives of his men. He was calculating, in real time, the risks and rewards of attacking an enemy whose strength was only partially known. As his forces moved deeper into the valley, the weight of this choice would become increasingly clear. Reno's assault, Custer's flanking maneuver, and Benteen's scouting mission were all parts of a larger plan that relied on speed, timing, and surprise. But with each passing minute, the complexity of coordinating these forces across miles of difficult terrain became more apparent. In that moment, Custer believed the risk was worth it. He had split his forces before and emerged victorious. But this time, the outcome would be tragically different. By 1:26 p.m., Custer had already committed his battalion to the high ground. As his men ascended the bluffs that towered above the Little Bighorn Valley, the vastness of the Indian village below came into view. It stretched farther than anyone had anticipated, a sprawling encampment of teepees and ponies, far larger than Custer had ever seen. In that instant, the scale of what he was up against became painfully clear. Still, Custer's resolve hardened. He believed his strategy, to attack from the rear while Reno engaged the front, was the key to victory. What Custer didn't know was that his enemy was not fleeing, but rallying for a counterattack. Gerard, Custer's trusted interpreter, had spotted the enemy movements first. From his position on a knoll, he saw the Indians driving their ponies downstream. It was a sight that should have signaled retreat, but Gerard's instincts told him otherwise. "There go your Indians running like devils," he shouted. This wasn't the panicked flight of a village caught off guard. It was the focused, determined movement of warriors preparing to defend their homes. Gerard's warning, delivered with urgency, was the first indication that the battle was not going as planned. Custer, however, was undeterred. He had always thrived on bold, decisive action, and his response was immediate. Instead of pulling back or regrouping, he decided to press forward with the flanking maneuver. His battalion would continue north, moving along the high ground to cut off the Indians' escape route. From this vantage point, Custer believed he could catch the village off guard, attacking from behind while Reno's forces pressed from the front. It was a classic hammer and anvil tactic, one that had worked for him in the past. But in the thick of this rapidly unfolding battle, Custer failed to realize the true strength of the force he was facing. The terrain itself posed a formidable challenge. The bluffs were steep and covered in rocky outcrops, making progress slow. As Custer's men followed the twisting trail that led along the ridge, the formation stretched out. Horses struggled to maintain their footing on the uneven ground, and the column began to break apart. This detail, often overlooked in traditional battle narratives, is critical to understanding why Custer's battalion became so vulnerable. The men were spread thin, and communication between the lead and rear of the column became increasingly difficult. Below, Reno's battalion was advancing toward the village, but the terrain made it impossible for Custer to see exactly what was happening. From his position on the ridge, Custer could only catch glimpses of Reno's forces through the breaks in the bluffs. This disconnect between the two columns would prove disastrous. Custer believed Reno was making progress, but in reality, Reno's battalion was encountering fierce resistance and was soon forced into retreat. The coordination that was so vital to Custer's plan was beginning to unravel, and neither Custer nor Reno fully understood the peril the other was facing. The Indians, far from fleeing, were now mobilizing for a full-scale counterattack. The warriors, led by experienced leaders like Crazy Horse and Gall, were positioning themselves to meet Custer's flanking force head-on. Custer, still confident in his strategy, continued to press northward, unaware that he was marching directly into a trap. As Custer's battalion moved deeper into the high ground, they encountered a series of coulees, deep ravines that crisscrossed the landscape. These natural obstacles slowed their progress even further, forcing the column into single file. The coulees, which acted as funnels, left the men exposed and vulnerable. It was here, in these narrow passages, that Custer's men first began to see signs that they were not alone. Scouts reported spotting small groups of Indians moving along the ridges, shadowing their movements. But instead of pulling back, Custer pressed on, determined to reach the far side of the village and complete the flanking maneuver. The significance of this moment cannot be overstated. Custer's decision to continue the advance, despite the growing signs of danger, reflects his unwavering belief in his own tactical superiority. This video sheds new light on the psychology of Custer's leadership, emphasizing that his actions were not born of recklessness, but of a deep-seated belief in his ability to outmaneuver the enemy. Yet, in this case, his overconfidence would prove fatal. At 1:42 p.m., from his position high above the valley, Custer surveyed the battlefield below. What he saw troubled him. The smoke rising from the village, the erratic movement of Reno's forces, and the sight of Indian warriors forming ranks in the distance all suggested that the situation was far worse than he had anticipated. Yet, despite these warning signs, Custer remained determined to press forward. His scouts, particularly Mitch Boyer and Gerard, were providing real-time updates, but the information was fragmented and incomplete. The testimonies of Custer's scouts during these critical moments provide a unique perspective that is often missing from other accounts of the battle. Boyer's report that the Indians were regrouping, and Gerard's observations of the warriors' movements should have triggered alarm bells for Custer. But instead, he saw these developments as a sign that his flanking maneuver was working. The Indians were focused on Reno's assault, leaving their rear vulnerable. Custer's misreading of the battlefield, compounded by the physical distance between his column and Reno's, would prove catastrophic. Curley, one of Custer's Crow scouts, later recounted his final moments with the battalion. He had seen the column stretch out as it advanced into the coulees, the formation thinning as the terrain dictated their movement. From his position, Curley saw what Custer could not. Indian forces were already moving to block their path. The warriors, led by Gall and Crazy Horse, had anticipated Custer's flanking maneuver and were preparing to counter it. As the column pressed into Medicine Tail Coulee, the last narrow ravine before the village, Custer's fate was sealed. Scouts reported spotting small groups of warriors on the ridges above, but by the time Custer realized the danger, it was too late. His battalion, now stretched thin and isolated, was in no position to defend itself. The full force of the Indian counterattack was about to crash down on them. The role of Iron Cedar, a Hunkpapa warrior, is often overlooked in popular accounts of the battle, but his actions were critical in shaping the final moments of Custer's life. Having spotted Custer's advance from his position on the ridge, Iron Cedar raced back to the village to warn the others. Within minutes, the entire village was aware of Custer's approach, and the warriors moved swiftly to intercept him. Gall, who had initially been focused on defending the village against Reno, now turned his attention to Custer's flanking force. By 2:05 p.m., Custer's battalion had reached the bottom of Medicine Tail Coulee. The men, exhausted from the difficult march, paused briefly to regroup. But before they could mount a defense, the first volleys of gunfire echoed through the ravine. The Indians, having anticipated Custer's movements, struck with overwhelming force. Within minutes, the battlefield descended into chaos. Custer's final hours have often been portrayed as a reckless charge into the unknown, but this video paints a more complex picture. Custer was not charging blindly. He was reacting to the information he had, making real-time adjustments based on the limited intelligence his scouts provided. But the sheer scale of the Indian forces, combined with the difficult terrain and the fragmentation of his own battalion, left him with few options. In the end, it was not just Custer's overconfidence that doomed him, but the failure of communication and the overwhelming strength of the force he faced. By the time Custer's battalion descended into Medicine Tail Coulee, it was already too late to alter the course of battle. The terrain had become their enemy just as much as the gathering Sioux and Cheyenne warriors. The coulees that Custer had relied upon for concealment were now bottlenecks, limiting the movement of his men and their ability to maintain any coherent formation. The afternoon sun bore down, casting long shadows over the rugged landscape, as the once orderly march deteriorated into a fragmented column of soldiers struggling against both the land and their growing fatigue. For Custer, however, the descent into Medicine Tail Coulee represented his last tactical maneuver, a final effort to outflank the Indian village and strike a decisive blow. At 2:05 p.m., Custer had reached the bottom of the coulee, and from this position he could see the Little Bighorn River ahead, glistening in the midday light. It was the river that he needed to cross in order to complete the flanking maneuver. His plan was simple but audacious: press through the coulee, cross the river, and hit the village from the rear, catching the Indians in a pincer movement between his battalion and Reno's forces. This, of course, was based on the assumption that Reno was still engaging the front of the village, and that the Indians were more focused on defending against the frontal assault. But unknown to Custer, Reno's attack had already faltered. Reno's forces, overwhelmed by the sheer number of Indian warriors, had been forced into retreat. At around 1:45 p.m., Reno had ordered his men to dismount and form a skirmish line, but the warriors, led by Crazy Horse and Gall, had launched a ferocious counterattack. Reno's battalion, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, had retreated into the timber along the river, where they tried to make a desperate stand. From Custer's position high on the bluffs, this chaotic retreat had been obscured by the terrain. As a result, Custer still believed that Reno's attack was proceeding according to plan, leaving him free to carry out his flanking maneuver. Eyewitness accounts from scouts like Curley and Mitch Boyer add valuable details to this crucial moment. Both men reported seeing Custer's column thinning out as it descended into the coulee. The rugged terrain, coupled with the heat of the afternoon, had taken its toll on both men and horses. The battalion had slowed to a crawl, with soldiers and animals struggling to keep pace. Boyer, in particular, noted the growing sense of unease among the men. They had expected to encounter fleeing Indians, but instead there were signs of a well-prepared defense. What Custer could not see, but the warriors could, was that his forces were now fully exposed. Iron Cedar, the Hunk Papa scout who had spotted Custer's movements earlier, had already alerted Gall and Crazy Horse to the presence of the flanking battalion. By the time Custer's forces reached the bottom of the coulee, the Indian warriors had already taken up positions on the ridges above. Custer's battalion was now caught in a deadly trap, with warriors preparing to strike from higher ground. The descent into Medicine Tail Coulee represents one of the most critical moments of the battle, yet it is often glossed over in traditional narratives. This video, however, emphasizes the importance of terrain in shaping the outcome. The coulee, which had initially offered concealment and tactical advantage, now became a funnel of death for Custer's men. The narrowing passageways, combined with the growing number of warriors gathering on the ridges, left Custer with few options. His plan to cross the river and outflank the village was rapidly collapsing as the reality of the battlefield set in. As the first volleys of gunfire echoed through the narrow ravine, the mood among Custer's men shifted from cautious optimism to sheer terror. The Indians, who had been shadowing Custer's movements from the ridges, were now fully engaged. Warriors, mounted on horseback and armed with rifles and bows, poured down from the heights, encircling Custer's battalion from all sides. The once silent hills were now alive with the shouts of warriors and the crack of gunfire. Custer, still believing that he could push forward, ordered his men to prepare for an assault. But by now, the reality of their situation was clear. They were trapped. Eyewitness accounts from surviving scouts and warriors described the intensity of the attack. The Indians, led by Gall and Crazy Horse, had executed a masterful ambush, using the terrain to their advantage. The ridges provided perfect cover for the warriors, allowing them to fire down into Custer's column with devastating accuracy. Every step Custer took deeper into Medicine Tail Coulee only tightened the noose around his forces. The soldiers, now fully aware of the scale of the Indian resistance, tried to form defensive positions, but the terrain offered little protection. Custer's tactical options were rapidly diminishing. He could not retreat. The coulee's narrow passages and the presence of Indian warriors on the ridges made any attempt to withdraw suicidal. Pressing forward was equally dangerous, as the river crossing ahead was now guarded by a growing force of Indian warriors. Custer's plan to outflank the village had backfired spectacularly. Instead of catching the Indians by surprise, he had walked his men into a trap from which there would be no escape. The intensity of the fighting in Medicine Tail Coulee is often underplayed in traditional battle narratives. This video, however, highlights the sheer brutality of the encounter. The Indian warriors, emboldened by their numerical superiority and the advantageous terrain, fought with a ferocity that stunned the soldiers. Gall, who had initially been focused on defending the village against Reno's attack, had now turned his full attention to Custer's flanking force. His warriors, positioned on the ridges, poured a relentless barrage of gunfire and arrows into the exposed soldiers below. Crazy Horse, known for his daring tactics, led a series of mounted charges, further disorienting Custer's men. Custer, despite the chaos unfolding around him, remained resolute. He had faced overwhelming odds before, and his belief in his own tactical brilliance was unshaken. He ordered his men to hold their positions, hoping that Benteen's battalion would arrive in time to reinforce them. But unbeknownst to Custer, Benteen had been delayed. At around 2:20 p.m., Benteen's forces were still several miles away, having been slowed by the difficult terrain and confusion over where to rendezvous with Custer. The much-needed reinforcements would not arrive in time. The encirclement was now complete. Custer's forces, outnumbered and outgunned, were trapped in the bottom of the coulee with no viable means of escape. The warriors on the ridges controlled the high ground, raining down fire on the soldiers below. Custer's men, many of whom had never faced such a determined enemy, were now fighting for their lives. The air was thick with dust and smoke, and the once confident soldiers were now scrambling to find any cover they could behind their horses and in the shallow depressions of the ravine. At this moment, the battle's outcome was no longer in doubt. The sheer number of Indian warriors, combined with the tactical advantage provided by the terrain, had overwhelmed Custer's forces. The question now was not if Custer's battalion would survive, but how long they could hold out before being completely overrun. By 2:30 p.m., Custer's battalion was in full retreat, though there was nowhere to go. The coulee had become a killing field, and the soldiers were dropping one by one under the relentless fire from the warriors above. Custer, realizing that the situation was hopeless, rallied his remaining men and moved them toward a small rise in the terrain, a final desperate attempt to make a stand. This rise, later known as Last Stand Hill, would become the site of Custer's final moments. The Last Stand, as it has come to be known, is one of the most iconic and mythologized events in American military history. But this video provides a sobering account of those final minutes, stripping away the romanticized imagery that has often accompanied the narrative. What occurred on that hill was not a glorious fight to the death, but a desperate, chaotic struggle for survival. The soldiers, now numbering fewer than 50, were completely surrounded. Their ammunition was running low, and the horses they had used for cover were either dead or dying. The sun beat down mercilessly as the men fired their last shots into the swarm of Indian warriors closing in from all sides. Custer's leadership in these final moments has been the subject of much debate. Some accounts portray him as a heroic figure, standing tall and defiant in the face of certain death. Others suggest that he was disoriented and confused, unable to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster that had unfolded around him. What is clear from the testimonies of the Indian warriors who witnessed the last stand is that Custer fought to the bitter end. According to several accounts, Custer was one of the last to fall, his body found near the top of the hill, surrounded by the bodies of his men. The warriors, having successfully surrounded and overrun Custer's position, moved in to finish off the remaining soldiers. The fighting was brutal and personal. Many of the Indian warriors had lost family members in previous conflicts with the U.S. Army, and their desire for revenge fueled their actions in those final moments. The soldiers, out of ammunition and with nowhere to hide, were quickly overwhelmed. Some accounts describe hand-to-hand combat as the warriors closed in, using knives and clubs to finish off the remaining survivors. By 2:45 p.m., the battle was over. Custer and his entire battalion had been wiped out, their bodies strewn across the hillside. The warriors, victorious and emboldened by their overwhelming victory, began to strip the bodies of weapons and supplies. According to Indian testimony, they left Custer's body largely untouched, recognizing him as a significant figure, though the details of this have been debated in various accounts. Other soldiers were less fortunate, with their bodies mutilated in acts of revenge and anger. The aftermath of the last stand was one of both triumph and tragedy. For the Sioux and Cheyenne warriors, it was a moment of unparalleled victory, a testament to their ability to defend their land and way of life against overwhelming odds. For the U.S. Army, it was a devastating defeat, one that would spark both outrage and renewed efforts to subdue the Native American resistance in the West. The final hours of the Battle of Little Bighorn, as detailed in this video, reveal a complex narrative of tactical miscalculation, overconfidence, and the brutal reality of warfare. Custer, who had once been celebrated as a brilliant military commander, had met his match not just in the strength of the Indian warriors, but in the unforgiving landscape and the limitations of his own leadership. The tunnel of uncertainty that surrounded his final hour remains, but the lessons of that day are clear. Even the most audacious strategies can unravel in the face of overwhelming force and unforeseen challenges. By 3 p.m. on June 25, 1876, the sounds of battle had faded, leaving a heavy silence over the valley. The sun continued to beat down on the now quiet battlefield, where just minutes before, one of the most dramatic clashes between the U.S. Army and Native American warriors had taken place. The warriors, victorious and still in shock at the scale of their triumph, moved through the aftermath, tending to their wounded and mourning the few dead they had lost. For the Sioux and Cheyenne, the victory was monumental, a testament to their unity and strength against the U.S. Army's relentless push to take their lands. But for the U.S. Army, the silence was deafening, a symbol of total defeat. The aftermath of Custer's defeat was not only physical, but also psychological for both sides. For the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, this victory proved that they could win against overwhelming odds, that they could resist the might of the United States government, at least for a time. The village was abuzz with the energy of victory, but there was also a sense of deep mourning for those who had died defending their people. According to several Native American accounts, the women and children who had been hiding during the battle emerged to honor the warriors who had fallen, and to join in the celebration of what would become one of their greatest triumphs in the resistance against American expansion. Yet, amidst this victory, many warriors knew that this moment of triumph would only intensify the U.S. government's efforts to subdue the Plains tribes. This victory was not the end of their struggle, but rather a high point in a war they understood was far from over. Leaders like Sitting Bull, Gall, and Crazy Horse recognized that they had struck a significant blow, but they were also aware that the U.S. Army would not take this defeat lightly. This was not the final battle, but the beginning of a new, more intense phase of resistance. The aftermath on the battlefield itself was grim. The bodies of Custer and his men lay scattered across Last Stand Hill and throughout Medicine Tail Coulee, many stripped of their uniforms and weapons, some mutilated by warriors seeking revenge for the deaths of their people in previous conflicts. Custer's body, according to most accounts, was found relatively unscathed compared to the others, though it was stripped of most of his belongings. There are conflicting reports about why Custer's body was left this way. Some say it was because the warriors recognized him as a high-ranking officer, while others claim that it was simply chance. The gruesome reality of the battlefield would become a critical symbol in the weeks and months to come. The sight of these mutilated bodies, left out in the open for days before they were found by General Terry's forces, would ignite outrage across the United States. The U.S. government, humiliated by the loss of an entire battalion, would respond with renewed determination to crush the Plains tribes and reclaim their land. As Terry's forces arrived at the scene of the battle days later, the full scale of the defeat became apparent. The sight of the battlefield, strewn with dead soldiers, horses, and abandoned equipment, was a powerful image of the tragedy that had befallen the Seventh Cavalry. Terry's men carefully surveyed the bodies, identifying Custer and his officers where possible, and began the grim task of burying the dead. The story of Custer's last stand quickly spread across the nation, fueled by both horror and fascination. For many Americans, Custer became a tragic hero, a symbol of the frontier spirit, while for others his defeat represented the perils of unchecked ambition and hubris. The recovery of the dead took place under somber conditions. As the soldiers of Terry's command moved across the battlefield, they were struck by the silence that now permeated the valley. The death toll was staggering. Custer and more than 200 of his men had been killed. Many of the dead were found in small groups, having formed defensive positions during their final moments. Last Stand Hill, where Custer and his closest men were found, became the focal point of the recovery effort. The task of burying the dead was not an easy one. The summer heat had taken its toll on the bodies, and the soldiers of Terry's command worked quickly to ensure that the fallen were given a proper burial, marking each grave with whatever materials they had on hand. Custer and many of his officers were initially buried on the battlefield, though Custer's remains would later be exhumed and reburied at West Point. For the rest of the fallen, the battlefield became their final resting place, marked by simple, makeshift graves that would later be replaced with more permanent markers. The Battle of Little Bighorn, often called Custer's Last Stand, would reverberate throughout American history and become one of the most iconic and misunderstood events of the Indian Wars. The defeat shocked the nation, prompting widespread media coverage and a wave of public mourning. But in time, the narrative surrounding Custer's death and the battle itself would become clouded by myth and legend, obscuring the true nature of what occurred on June 25, 1876. This video offers a closer look at those final moments, correcting common misinterpretations and shedding light on the complexities of both Custer's leadership and the Native American resistance. For years after the battle, Custer's legacy was that of a fallen hero. The American public, desperate for a martyr in their ongoing westward expansion, elevated Custer to almost mythical status. He was portrayed in newspapers and books as a brave, tragic figure, a man who had fought valiantly against overwhelming odds. His death was seen as a symbol of the country's manifest destiny, a hero who had given his life for the cause of civilization and progress. Popular stories of Custer's last stand depicted him as the last man standing, fighting to the bitter end with his saber in hand, surrounded by a swarm of Indian warriors. These accounts, though dramatized, fed into the narrative that Custer's defeat was a tragic but noble sacrifice. However, over time, historians began to reevaluate Custer's actions in the light of new evidence and testimony. The more accurate story that emerged was not one of a noble hero overwhelmed by savage forces, but of a commander whose overconfidence, poor communication, and failure to understand the true nature of the enemy led his men into a catastrophic defeat. Custer's decision to split his forces, his disregard for the intelligence provided by his scouts, and his misjudgment of the size and determination of the native forces all contributed to his downfall. The true Custer was not the legend of the last stand, but a flawed leader whose ambition outweighed his tactical judgment. For the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, the Battle of Little Bighorn represented both a triumph and a moment of deep mourning. The victory had demonstrated their ability to defend their lands and way of life against a powerful and determined enemy. It had shown that, for all the might of the U.S. military, the Plains tribes were still a force to be reckoned with. Yet, in the wake of the battle, many leaders recognized that the victory would be short-lived. The U.S. government would not allow the defeat to go unanswered, and the military response would be swift and unforgiving. Indeed, the months following the battle saw a massive escalation in the U.S. military campaign against the Plains tribes. In the immediate aftermath, General Phil Sheridan and the War Department launched a series of punitive expeditions designed to hunt down and subdue the Native American forces responsible for Custer's defeat. This would eventually lead to the forced surrender of many of the tribes involved, including the eventual capture of key leaders like Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. The defeat at Little Bighorn, far from deterring U.S. expansion, only intensified the government's efforts to end the Indian resistance once and for all. Today, the legacy of Custer's last stand is one of both tragedy and reflection. The site of the battle, now preserved as the Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument, serves as a reminder of the complexities and contradictions of American history. For Native Americans, it stands as a symbol of resistance, a place where their ancestors fought bravely to defend their way of life. For the descendants of the soldiers who fell alongside Custer, it is a place of somber remembrance, where the price of ambition and expansion is made starkly clear. The legacy of the Battle of Little Bighorn continues to evolve. In recent years, efforts have been made to recognize the role of Native American warriors in the battle and to tell their stories alongside the more traditional narratives of Custer and his men. For many, this represents a long overdue acknowledgement of the Native perspective, one that has often been marginalized or ignored in American history. The monument now includes memorials not only to the soldiers who died, but also to the Native American warriors who fought and won a crucial victory for their people. In the end, the Battle of Little Bighorn was not just a clash of armies, but a clash of cultures, each fighting for its survival. For Custer and his men, it was the culmination of a failed campaign, a tragic end to their efforts to subdue the West. For the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, it was a moment of triumph, a testament to their courage and resilience. And for the United States, it was a sobering reminder that even the most powerful empires can fall in the face of determined resistance.